Good morning, good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Ooh. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Oh, good morning, good morning, good morning. All right. Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome to Daring Dialogues. I am your host, Shantae Charles. I want to say good morning to YouTube live streamers. Good morning, Lady Judy. Good morning, Lady Barbara. Good morning, Pastor Ben. Good morning, Lady Latoya. And each and every one of you who will drop in today, I want to say good morning. Good morning to Sir Walter Jones. I know he listens quite a bit on our Thursday morning broadcast in terms of theology, which is what we like to talk about here. We like to talk about spiritual matters, secular matters from a spiritual perspective. So if you are new with us for the first time, Daring Dialogues is a series of talks that I give Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And every day of the week, we try to focus on a different subject and a different theme. So if you're with us today, yesterday we covered relationships, and we were really digging into marriage and marriage styles. Today we are jumping back into what we would call Theology Thursday and our Thinking Thursday. And as promised, some of you saw my page yesterday, so you know what I'm about to say. As promised, I told you all that I was going to go and I was going to look and find some books that would help us to better illustrate the point that we're going to talk about today. So I just want to give you a little rundown of what happened when I went to the library. Good morning, Lady Evelyn. So again, I am an educator. Okay, that's my first most and foremost profession. All right. I also was a librarian for about 5 years. At my first teaching job, I oversaw and I ran the library for my school. A couple of years down the line into my career, about 6 years ago now, I was a library assistant and research assistant. So I have a really good background in library science, how libraries are run, how you can research things, which is why, and I love to research personally. That's like a passion of mine, is to research. And so I know a lot about a lot of things. So I went to the library in my county yesterday, my local library, and I went up to the counter and I asked a gentleman, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, so let me hurry up. So I asked the gentleman, hello, I'm trying to find some books with some images. I began to give him time periods for art that I was specifically looking for, so that I would be able to get books that specifically pull from that time period. So we went around the library, looked in the different sections. We looked in religion. We looked in, where else did he take me? History. And then we looked in the art history section. And at first, we couldn't find any books. Well, he couldn't find any books. And so I said, okay, well, since you can't find them this way, he was like, well, ma'am, I'm sorry, there's not much we can do. I guess we don't have those kind of books that you're looking for, et cetera, et cetera. So I said, well, can you type in images of Christ, or can you type in iconography? Because you might be able to find it that way. So he typed that in, and then we went back over to the religion section, and he pulled out a book. But after looking at the book yesterday, I realized it didn't really have the images that I was looking for. So he said, well, I can't help you anymore. I got to go to lunch, etc. Bye-bye. So I let him go to lunch. And then I went back to those same shelves and started looking through the books in more detail. And I was able to actually find 3 books with exactly what I needed, with exactly what I was looking for. So I don't want to chalk it up to him just being how can I put it? I don't want to chalk it up to him deliberately not looking for what I needed to find, but I know that as soon as he left and went to lunch, I went back to those same shelves and found what I was looking for. So we have plenty of images to show you today. And we're going to be paying close attention to the time period of these images so you can understand that the further people went along in time, and depending on the painter, okay, images of Christ began to shift and change. If you all are interested in doing some more off the cuff study, if you type in Russian icons, there's actually here, I can't remember if it's Massachusetts area or not, but there's a museum here in the United States called Russian Icons. And you can go to it right here in the United States, and they have a whole museum of Russian images from the time of Christ. And they're like some of the earliest images. And I was looking at the video of the inside of this museum. Somebody was, walking around the museum and showing the images. And almost all of the images are black. And the person was kind of shocked, like, why are all these images of Christ black? Like they couldn't wrap their head around why all of these paintings that came out of Russia, all right, were black. All right. So if you do a little history, you will know do a little study, you will know that most of the early images were black. Why? Because they were black. I mean, it's not rocket science. But as time went on, those images began to be whitewashed. And then people began to paint Bible characters in the likeness of themselves, in the likeness of their culture. Sometimes the artists were commissioned to paint a religious scene, but they were commissioned to paint their patrons into the scene. So if your patrons are European, or they're not melanated, all right, then they're painting the likeness of the people that they're commissioned to paint into these scenes. So I think people need to understand that as well. Let's go into our reading for today. Jesus in an Age of Devotion. And we are, believe it or not, we're about halfway through Jesus, The Essence of Jesus by Arthur Rowe. And before we go there, I want to show you one image from this book. This is called The Dangerous Book by Steve and Jackie Green. I have previewed it. I don't know if I will read it for Daring Dialogues. But they do have, it's based on the new museum they just opened up here in DC, the Museum of the Bible. So if you get a chance to come up here to DC, you can actually check this museum out. It's got all of these different artifacts and things from Bible times. And they also have people who do reenactments and stuff like that. But I hope all the reenactors are not European, because if I go in there, I'm going to probably say something about that. That's just me. All right. But inside of this museum, they actually have a little color section here. And inside of the museum, these are some of the things that are in the museum. And I wanted to point out this particular triptych. A triptych is a painting that has 3 sides to it. All right. This is an Ethiopian triptych from the 1600s. Okay. They don't have the exact date, but it's from the 1600s, depicting the Virgin and Child, other figures from the Bible and Christian tradition. All right. So I'm going to bring it very close. Let me get this out of the way here so I don't knock anything over. All right. I'm going to bring it very close. And Lady Judy, I'll come over there in just a second. Can you all see that? All right. That's the 1600s Jesus. All right. Out of Ethiopia. All right. That's not Kenny Loggins. And yeah, that's not the Sunshine Band. And let me bring it over here for my YouTube live stream. All right. So that's Ethiopia 1600s. Good morning, Lady Andrea. All right. So let's jump into, we know that there's been some early Christians. We talked about Constantine's influence. We'll probably come back to him again. Some of the other books that I'm reading talk about Constantine's influence again, and they talk about it in a little bit more detail. But this piece that we're covering today is Jesus in an Age of Devotion, because it leads us right into the whole issue of the iconoclast and iconography. So you'll be able to understand what actually happened, and then we'll get into some images, and then we'll be done for today. In the middle of the 15th century, one of the most far-reaching technical inventions of all time began to transform human life and culture. In the city of Mainz in the Rhineland, Johann Gutenberg invented a machine for printing using movable type. The first dated work from his press is a Latin Psalter of the year 1454. From then on, instead of copying books by hand, thousands of identical copies could be produced at one printing. All right. So this became a seminal technology moment, like how the personal computer became a technology moment for the world, right? Because you had big supercomputers that took up an entire room, and they were able to take that information and create a machine and compress it down to a machine that could fit on your desk. And then they were able to give everyone a personal computer. That was revolutionary. Well, that is how revolutionary at the time it was for people to not have to write, hand scribe every single book. The Gutenberg press brought this revolution to how books would be copied and how books could be printed and how books could be made in mass numbers. All right. So from then on, instead of copying books by hand, thousands of identical copies could be produced at one printing. At about the same time, the capital of the Roman Empire in the East, Constantinople, fell into Muslim hands. And Justinian's great church of St. Sophia was turned into a mosque. All right. This suggests that the 15th century was a significant turning point in human history. It was, because many of the places that had been taken for Christ were now being turned over to Islam. Before then, the period from the 5th or 6th centuries is sometimes called the era of Christian civilization, but it was marked by power struggles between emperors and leaders of this new church. There was rivalry between the Bishop of Rome, who we now know as the Pope, okay? And we see that the Bishop of Rome is still in play, and the patriarchs of the Eastern Church. From the 7th century, the Eastern churches lost territory to the rise of Islam, even if they also expanded further north through missions to the Slavs. European countries responded to the Pope's appeal so that they wouldn't lose ground to begin to mount crusades against heretics and to free the holy places in Palestine from Muslim control. But the armies were sometimes also used against Eastern churches. And this is something that people don't want to talk about, because when we're asking about, and I know I've been researching the last week trying to figure out what happened to all of these Eastern churches. All right. We know that a lot of what we get from Western Christianity comes through the church, the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope. So my question was, we know that there was an East and a West. What happened to the East? Well, what happened to the East was The Pope was also not just attacking the Muslims, but he was also attacking the Eastern churches. All right. But the essence of Jesus is not easily found in political and military power struggles. Rather, we need to turn to the churches and monasteries, to popular and more esoteric expressions of spirituality. There were clearly two different ways of living the Christian life. What we might call full-time vocational or professional religious life, and the popular religion of stories, of ceremonies, and great occasions. We will find Jesus in pictures, an incredible wealth of paintings, frescoes, reliefs, icons, and illuminated manuscripts. He is also encountered in processions, pilgrimages, and miracle plays. People chanted and sang or recited poems about him or preached in the open air. Finally, we can look into the writings of the mystics and the theologians. So in the other book that we're reading, we're actually going to get into this part in detail. There's a whole section that we're going to read that's going to talk about monastic life. What happened to some of the believers during that time? Many of them were treated into a monastery life, living as monks. All right. And so there's a whole period of that we're going to talk about. But also, we're also going to talk about the worship or the cult of the saints, that many people began to take these pilgrimages, not necessarily for Christ, but they were taking these pilgrimages to mark the spots where certain people died on behalf of Christ. So they were taking pilgrimages to commemorate and to follow the steps of people who had martyred themselves for Christ, which we know became, some of these people became sainted and etc. And so people in their worship of Christianity, they also took on this ritual of pilgrimages. All right. And it became known as the cult of the saints. Another thing we don't talk enough about in Western Christianity. All right. Jesus in pictures. All right. So this book is actually kind of moving us forward. And you're looking at a period between 1300. We're looking at between 1300 and 1800. All right. Between 1300 and 1800. We're going to look today at two words you need for today: iconography. And many of you should have learned this in your history class if you did world history. Iconography and iconoclastic controversy. So iconography is the study of signs and symbols. And when I was in college, I did several papers on the study of signs and symbols, specifically in Christian art. The iconoclasts were people who felt a certain way about images and imagery. All right. So that's what we're going to talk about right now. Once again, we need to recall the significance of the different contexts within which these pictures are or were seen. Different contexts prompt different meanings. Today, many of these paintings are found in art galleries and museums where they celebrate human achievement. But when they were painted, both artists and patrons used them in churches and homes as aids or as help to devotion. So I want you to think about if these people who had such a controversy over images, all right, being used in churches and being used in worship, what would they think about our iPod, iPhone, meme, selfie society today? They would probably take our phones and be throwing them and stepping on them and burning them. All right. Because that's how deeply they felt about not using imagery in worship. All right. So you had a group of people who wanted to use these images, use these paintings, these depictions as a way to help them to imagine certain things about scripture. And then you had another group of people that said, we don't want to use any images, specifically images of the saints and images of Christ. All right. So that's what began to bring this controversy. It would be like people saying, we think television is the devil, or we think movies are the devil. This was their battle back in the early church, was should we use images or should we not use images? And what kind of images should we use? Should we limit this particular thing when we're talking about the worship of Christ? All right. So they were using them in churches, in homes, as help for their devotion. Many were altarpieces and painted to be seen in the context of the Eucharist or the Mass, itself one of the most powerful of all picture dramas. When we look at them, we see something foreign perhaps, but inviting us to compare as we know it with what we see. There are some constant features of human nature which allow us to empathize with and to understand people of a bygone world. But we have to recognize that the original context of these pictures, the original context of the pictures that you see in the museums all over the world, was for prayer and worship. Let's say that again. When you go into a museum and you're looking at these paintings, many of those paintings were used in prayer and worship to Christ. Some of those paintings were actually at the altar where people would go and pay their homage and pay their worship to Christ. Clearly, too, we will appreciate this dimension more fully if we visit, for example, the National Gallery or spend some time looking at reproductions in books or exhibition catalogs, which we're going to do today. Two valuable resources for this purpose are Gabriel Finaldi's The Image of Christ, the catalog of the exhibition Seeing Salvation, held in the National Gallery in 2000 CE, and the accompanying book, Seeing Salvation, Images of Christ in Art, which I could not get my hands on this particular book, but I'm still looking for it. The iconoclastic controversy, all right, it was right to paint pictures or icons of Jesus. Was it right? That was the controversy. All right. We know you want to portray John the Baptist. We know you want to portray angels. We get it. But the controversy arose with the question, is it right to paint pictures or icons of Jesus? I think those who struggle with that question would look at us today and say, I told y'all not to paint those pictures of Jesus, because here it is, 2018, and what are people having arguments over? They're having arguments over the image of Christ. They're having arguments over, was Jesus blonde-haired and blue-eyed? Or was Jesus an olive-toned skinned man? Or was Jesus as dark as the universe with dreadlocks? And so I believe these people now would be looking, all right, and saying, we told y'all, we told you all, there was going to come controversy about who and what Jesus looked like. So they were already having this argument all the way back then. In the 8th and 9th centuries, fierce controversies raged over this question, particularly in the Eastern or Orthodox churches. And this is what happened. So when people say, why is it so hard to find early images of Christ's portrayal? Here's why. People went around destroying what they took to be idolatrous images, clearly forbidden as they felt in the second of God's 10 commandments. In any case, if Jesus were divine, how could his divine glory possibly be painted? All right. Yes, you could paint the man, but what about his glory? So how are you going to depict that? All right. They didn't have all of the glow stuff that we have today through digital technology. all right, and all the advancements we have visually. So how are you going to paint his glory? Was it possible to depict Christ as the God-man? The defenders of icons and pictures replied that the doctrines of creation and the incarnation invited such representation of God. They distinguished worship that should be given to God alone from honor given to that which represented him or the Virgin or the saints. John of Damascus in the 8th century saw the Old Testament prohibitions of images as a sign of the future coming of God in the flesh, and said that after the incarnation, such images were allowed. By becoming a man, God had made it possible to paint a portrait of that man, and God had created the painter's art and materials. A 15th century Franciscan preacher gave 3 reasons for religious images in churches. First, so that these were the reasons that they were given, okay? These were the arguments again for having images. Argument number 1. First, so that the ignorant and the illiterate might learn the faith. He said, some of these people can't read. All right? Just as it is in our culture now, all right, there are some people who do better with visuals. All right? And so there were illiterate people in their day too. They could not read. They could not read Latin and some of these other languages. So he said, a helpful way to teach the gospel is by giving people visuals, because some of them were ignorant and illiterate, and they needed to learn the faith as well. And this was a way to help them learn the faith. Second, to stir people's natural emotional sluggishness and move them to devotion. So he was like, I'm sure all the worship leaders can attest to that. All right. Encourage people to devotion. Why do people have all of the visual effects and the sound effects and the theater lights and the strobes and yeah. Encouraging the sluggish to move them to devotion. Interesting how many of these reasons have not changed, right? And third, to act as reminders to people who otherwise would forget what they had heard. So images, even as they are used today, was a way in a form of a memory device. Remember? Because if I can get you to hear it through sound and see it through your eyes, the more senses I engage in learning, the more I'm likely to retain what I have learned. All right? So these were the counter arguments to people who said, we don't need any images. Other people argued, yes, we do. And here's 3 reasons why. We have ignorant and illiterate people who can't read the text. Okay? We have people who can't read the text. So these images are helpful. Then we want to encourage people to move to devotion, to be moved to devotion. And then lastly, it is a memory device. It helps people to remember and retain what they have heard about the gospel. All right? So those were the 3 main reasons that they argued for the use of images. All right? Although there were further iconoclastic outbursts at later periods, in general, the defenders of icons and pictures won the day. They won the day. All right? Icons. Let me give you a little subsection here on icons. Icons were different. They were sometimes said to be an extension of the incarnation or a door into the divine realm, a meeting point of divine grace and human need. The spiritual world was held to manifest itself in and through the material world. So icons were painted in the context of prayer and used in the context of devotion. In Orthodox liturgy, icons embodied the presence of the spiritual world. They helped to meet that human passion so characteristic of this age, the passion to get close to God, to know Him, and to share His divine nature. So as I have tried to explain to people who utilize visual design, who utilize graphics, who may not have gone to school professionally for it like I did, one of the first things they teach you is that art is spiritual. Art is belief. Art is a form of faith. And they just told you, all right, that these people use art as a door into the divine realm. And many people still use art as a door into the divine realm, even if you only see that art for its beauty on the surface, or even if you only see that art for its entertainment. The reality is, those of us who are professional artists know and understand that there's levels to what we are putting out into the world, and there's levels to what we are producing. So when we have conversations about something not just being entertainment, or when we say that something is not just art, there's a spiritual realm that is connected to, okay? And here's the other piece. Whatever's in that artist's spirit as he is creating is being pushed out of that piece into the material world. I know that was a little bit probably over some people's heads, but I'm going to try to say it again in a way that you can understand. Whatever's in an artist spiritually, when that artist begins to produce and create, all right, it connects his spirit with his creation that's producing a material that's going to go out into the world. All right. This is why people have a problem with bumping to music, all right, by somebody whose spirit is a spirit of perversion. All right. I know they don't teach this in church. This is a whole other side of church. All right. That's why you can listen to certain music and feel a certain kind of way. 9 times out of 10, if you go back to that artist who produced it and what their lifestyle is like, whatever you were feeling in that music, I guarantee you they're doing it in their life. This is why it is important that you are aware of what you are intaking, because when you intake art and when you intake entertainment, you're not just intaking the surface level of a thing. You're intaking that realm that they opened to you. All right. This is why I don't do horror movies. This is why I don't do blood and guts and gore and ripping off people's heads and all of that stuff. I'm like, man, what is in your spirit? Jesus, I don't need any of that. All right. So, I don't know if you all saw Black Panther, but Black Panther is a very good example of that. All right. In that film, and I won't do any spoilers today, but some of y'all need to go see the movie this weekend. All right. So I can really talk about it. In that movie, all right, it's a perfect example of showing spirituality. And if you were not careful, you missed all of the cues of what kind of spirituality they were referring to in that movie. So some people went in and they took all of that in. But if you are a believer, there should have been some guards within you that went up when certain things were being talked about and certain things were being enacted in that movie. All right. Again, let me say it one more time. These pieces were said to be an extension of the incarnation, or a door into the divine realm, a meeting point of divine grace and human need. And when these artists were creating, they understood that. There's a lot of people who are artistic and they're creative, and they may have the skill for their craft, but they don't have the theory behind their skill. They don't understand the intricacy of what they're doing. All right. So they're doing it, but as Paul would say, they're not doing it according to knowledge. They may be doing it according to their skill. So someone can be highly skilled and still not understand the spiritual implications of what they're releasing into the earth, which is a dangerous thing. Y'all about to get me preaching about art, and I'm trying not to go there. All right. So let's finish up with, see if we can get through. I want to make sure I get through the piece on just art for today. All right. Medieval art. An example of a picture from the 10th century is the Nativity in the Anglo-Saxon Benedictional of St. Athelwold, now kept in the British Library. It can be viewed with a helpful commentary on the CD, Images of Salvation, the story of the Bible through medieval art. This manuscript miniature, which measures approximately 210 by 150 millimeters, shows a virgin, a midwife who holds a cushion behind Mary's head, and Joseph. The midwife, who is not mentioned in the New Testament, but appears in the 2nd century Gospel of James, is indicating to Joseph that the bright cloud signifies the divine nature of the birth. So where is Jesus? In the bottom left-hand corner of the page, lying on a crib, which looks more like an altar. This may well have linked the nativity with the future death of this child and the Eucharist, in which that death is brought home to participants in the church. Its position in the picture also recalls the idea that Christ is the cornerstone of the church. So when we talk about iconography, everything in a piece, everything in a picture, when an artist drew it, everything had a symbol to it. Everything had a deeper meaning than the piece that you saw. All right. And the study of iconography is to help you understand what those symbols are, because when you look at a picture, you're basically reading the symbols for it. All right. This happens a lot with movies. This happens a lot in music videos, where there's one layer where the artist is performing, and then you'll have someone come and they'll do a breakdown of what all the signs and the symbols were in that particular art. I know Ryan Coogler did that recently with the fight scene. If you Google or if you YouTube Ryan Coogler's fight scene breakdown, he actually breaks down all of the symbolism, the colors, the visuals, etc. in that fight scene that you might not have seen in the movie. And it's actually a pretty awesome thing that he does, because he shows you a little bit of the artistic mind that goes into creating. All right. So when people in this particular time period, when they looked at a piece, they weren't just looking at it from, oh, this is the scene. No, if there was an apple in the painting, for example, they knew that that apple represented sin and temptation. If there was a halo, like we talked about last week, behind the person's head, that represented that person was either an apostle or he was Christ himself, because Christ usually had the largest halo if there were other people in the picture. So they understood the symbolism when they were looking at the picture. So as they're talking about this one, if Christ was down in the end of the piece, on the corner of the piece, it represented that Christ, though he was a baby in the picture, he also represented being the cornerstone of the church. The major theme is God made man, but other themes are part of the whole picture. The advantage of pictures like this is that the whole and the parts can be seen at the same time, unlike the telling of a narrative, although narratives need to be known in order to interpret the picture. Another example of these presentations is Piero della Francesca's The Baptism of Christ, which is located in the National Gallery. Jesus is standing in the center while John the Baptist pours water over him, and I think we'll see some images of that shortly. Above him, the Holy Spirit in the form of a dove is coming upon him as the Gospels tell the story. Beside Jesus is a tree. This tree recalls the tree of life in the Garden of Eden and may hint at the cross. The tree of life was forfeited by Adam and Eve, but Jesus has come to make its fruit available, even though it will cost him his life on the cross. In the painting, Jesus is standing on dry ground, recalling the Israelites crossing the Jordan to enter the promised land. Behind John, another candidate prepares for baptism. This indicates that Jesus stood in the place of human beings and invites others to follow him. There are figures dressed like the Magi of the Nativity also in this background. Some writers see the three angels to the left as a tree as a reminder of the Trinity. In the distance is a hint of a city, perhaps Jerusalem, and all of this is set in a 15th century Italian Renaissance setting, showing its relevance to the artist's time. The cross. The most widely recognized symbol of Christianity is the cross. Part of the Celtic legacy in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland are stone, moon, water, a boat, sheep, and birds. Oh, whoa, excuse me, wrong page. It's like, skip the page, sorry. Part of the Celtic legacy in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland are stone crosses with the arms and upright of the cross linked by arcs of a circle. Most of you all have seen a Celtic cross. You can Google it and look at the image of it. This suggests the cross surrounded by a wreath of victory, much as Constantine's soldiers had the Cairo sign surrounded by a wreath. Certainly, the earlier representations of Christ on the cross show him alive and reigning, as it were, from the cross. This can be seen in the second of 4 5th century reliefs on the 4 sides of a casket in the British Museum. It encourages the viewer to be reminded that Christ opened the gates of paradise not only for the thief crucified beside him, but to every believer. Such pictures stress the divinity of Christ. A 13th century panel known as the Man of Sorrows, one half of a diptych, which is a 2-paneled painting, in the National Gallery illustrates this trend, but it is still the rather symbolized Byzantine style. The following centuries produced the more realistically human Jesus. Giotto's early 14th century paintings were strikingly lifelike and realistic. This trend began to reach a climax at Grunewald's dramatic altarpiece for a monastery, completed by 1516. It was a complex structure which included a number of different pictures, and some of which were folded inside the others. In the closed position, viewers saw the crucifixion scene flanked by 2 pictures of saints. It is a striking image. The flesh of Christ has been ripped by the lashes and reflects that of people dying from the plague at the time, called burning sickness. The crown of thorns had long, sharp spikes. The body is twisted with agony and blood flows from a wound in his side. So, even as people were making these pictures, right, they were still speaking to whatever the ailments were of the people at the time, which in turn would have provided some sort of comfort to those who may have been going to the place to worship, but were dealing with this sickness. So when they went to the altar, they would see an image of Christ suffering as they did, which in turn brought a measure of comfort to those people as they went into the sanctuary. Mary is fainting into the arms of the disciple John in the piece, while Mary Magdalene weeps on her knees at the foot of the cross. On the other side of the cross is John the Baptist pointing to Jesus, the Lamb of God, who is dying to take away the sins of the world. Any human suffering from the plague who contemplated this picture would have realized that Christ himself understood what suffering was like from his own experience. When the 2 hinge panels on which the crucifixion is painted are open out, they reveal 3 brightly brilliant pictures. One of the Annunciation, one of the Nativity, and a dramatic, dazzling resurrection scene. The rising Christ is seen in a large halo of golden light. Here is Jesus not only restored, but glorified, as 3 disciples had once seen him on the Mount of Transfiguration. This is the victory of light over darkness. And those who came for Mass to this altar were confronted not only with the extremes of suffering, but they were also confronted with self-sacrifice and hope of a resurrection at the end. All right. So these altar pieces would have been today's worship screens that people have in their churches. All right. And they're flashing images while you're worshiping. And they have the lyrics on the screen, and they maybe have other images behind those lyrics. You get that similar feel. So who is this? Pictures of Christ often included the Virgin Mary, sometimes with the child Jesus sitting on her lap as if enthroned, sometimes breastfeeding the child, so illustrating his two natures. There were also many pictures of saints. The Virgin and the saints were regarded as people who had got very close to Jesus and so might speak a word for less worthy worshipers. In the summer of 2005, England's oldest altarpiece went on display at the National Gallery in London. It is a large altar panel, probably painted for the restoration of Westminster Abbey in 1269. It is divided into 5 panels. In the center, Christ holds a beautiful miniature representation of earth, which includes the sun, moon, water, a boat, sheep, and birds. He holds the whole world in his hand. This is in striking contrast to Italian altarpieces of this period, which show Christ on the cross. Also unusual are scenes depicting the miracles of Christ, the raising of Jairus' daughter, the healing of the man born blind, and the feeding of the 5,000. All right, so we're getting ready to get into some imagery looking, and hopefully I have enough time to show you all the ones I have picked out, because I got a few. All right, so from the library, where the librarian told me that they could not find any books on Jesus and his images. All right, what does this say on the front cover? Jesus, an illustrated life. Okay, literally, Jesus in pictures. All right, so let's get into it. Remember, the period that these paintings are going to come from is between 1300 and 1800. So here's one, and this is said to be one of the oldest paintings. Let me see. This is from, let me give you the date. This is called The Disputation with the Doctors. Italian artist Duccio Buoninsegna, and it is dated to around 1311. This is important because this is one of the earlier pieces that wasn't destroyed by the fanatics who were like, tear everything down. So if you want to, you can screenshot this. All right. This is probably one of the blackest Jesuses you're going to see. This is 1311, people. All right. More than 180 years before Columbus sails the ocean blue. Painted by an Italian painter. So if you want to screenshot that. All right. I don't know about you, but that doesn't look like Kenny Loggins. Okay, that one's called Jesus is Disputing with the Doctors. So that's 1311. All right, let's see how quickly Jesus changes. All right, this one is by Italian Renaissance artist Domenico Ghirlandaio, and this is the calling of St. Peter and Andrew. They're depicting Jesus calling Peter and Andrew, and this is 1481. All right, 1481. Still right before, this is now getting closer to Columbus sailing the ocean blue. All right. 1481, this piece. Anybody see a difference in how the image of Christ has shifted in 170 years? Gonna keep on moving here. Doop-de-doop-de-doo. So I got 2 more books to show you. All right, this is Christ at the Pool of Bethesda. This is a painting by a Spanish Baroque artist, Bartolomé Murillo, and it was painted between 1667 and 1670. All right, here it is. So this is now 1600s. Slaves have already arrived in the Americas. All right, the first slaves arrived. Some people say 1619, some people say 1620 in Jamestown, Virginia. This is painted by a Spanish painter. Gonna keep moving. This one is called Christ Carrying the Cross, using oils. This is the Spanish Renaissance artist, Vicente Masip. The Renaissance period is after the Dark Ages, after people are coming out of a time of ignorance, after people are coming out of disease and Black Plague and all of that. Renaissance is a rebirth of the arts. And with that rebirth of the arts, we see there's a change of imagery. All right, here you go. Christ carrying the cross. So just think about that. From 1311 all the way into, this piece was dated between 1475 to 1550. All right, so this is still in the early New World. But as you can see, the images and the imagery have already been shifted. Here's another one. This is early Italian Renaissance artist Fra Angelico. And this one is called, where is it? Opposites. Let me see. Make sure I'm reading the right one. Oh, following page, excuse me. This is called the Pietà de Villeneuve-Avignon. It was painted by a French late medieval artist, and it was painted in 1455. This is a double page spread. 1455. Okay. 1455. So you're looking at about 40 years here before Columbus sails. All right, here's another book. In the Footsteps of Jesus, Chronicle of his life and the origins of Christianity. All nice and well. Let's take a look at the images. And then you'll begin to understand why we have people that make the comments they make here in the United States. Because if these are the only images you're seeing constantly for several hundred years, then your imagery and your imagining of Christ is going to be Eurocentric. All right? Unless you do some digging and unless you're exposed to something other than these kinds of images. So here's one of the Virgin Mary, painted by Renaissance artist Angelo Bronzino, excuse me. And this was painted around 1550. So you're talking, what, less than 60 years after Columbus sails. This is the Virgin Mary. All right. Remember, the iconoclasts went around destroying and burning up the original images that people were painting. All right. So now they're making their own images. They're being commissioned to create their new images. Here's another one. This is the Venetian artist Giovanni Bellini. This is supposed to be Jesus' presentation in the temple, and this was painted between 1490 and 1500. That would have been right around the time that Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So this becomes baby Jesus between 1490, all right, between 1490 and 1550. You're speechless? Huge difference? Yeah, I know. All right. So how important are artists to maintaining an accurate historical record? I want y'all to think about that, all of you artists out here. How important are artists to maintaining an accurate and historical record? And should we really just go around manipulating things the way we have been? Or is there some kind of responsibility that we have in creating in a way that's authentic to our culture, to the times that we live in, or even authentic to Scripture? Here's another one. This is the baptism of Christ, created around 1515. So again, this is still Columbus sails 1492, 1515. That's what, 24 years. All right. You're still in the early parts of the New World and discovery. This is their version of the baptism by John. Okay. Somebody said huge difference. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm getting at. And I'm taking my time. I know we're running out of minutes here, so let me finish up. I'm probably not going to show you all of the rest of them I have labeled, but you're getting the idea, right? You get the picture. Let's see. Ah, the famous one. The Leonardo da Vinci painting of the Last Supper. Listen to when it was painted. It was painted in a monastery in Milan, Italy, and it was painted between 1495 and 1498. That's when it was painted. All right. So shortly after they launch to the New World. This one, boy, oh gosh. This one was painted, and this, of course, we get into the later years now. This is 1880. This is after the abolition of, or the abolishment of slavery. This is called the flagellation of our Lord Jesus Christ. All right. Everybody see that? Notice how his body has become grotesquely pale. All right. So he's even, in this piece, he's even paler than the other quote unquote white men around him. All right. So when you start connecting these images, and then you start connecting this notion of, here's another one. This is 1605, Christ on the cross. All right. Notice the paleness and notice the whiteness. So when you start connecting these pieces, these pictures, you start realizing why people connected whiteness with rightness. Do I need to write that down for y'all? The connection of whiteness with rightness. Excuse my sloppy cursive at the end there. All right. Whiteness equals rightness. All right. And this is so ingrained in people's minds now that white is associated with divine. It's associated with spiritual. It's associated with closeness to God. So when you have several hundred years of this, all right, that whiteness is ingrained in people's minds and it's attached to salvation. It's attached to the most powerful spiritual notions of transformation in the world. It's going to be hard to just shake that. Okay? This is why when people who are white do heinous things to people of color, what is the first words out of many people of color's mouth? Without even processing, and this was happening a lot during the shootings of unarmed black men, without even processing the heinousness of what was done to their relatives, all right? Without allowing them to grieve, without allowing them to cry, a microphone was stuck in these people's faces and they were expected to say this, weren't they? If I'm telling an untruth, somebody correct me. All right? They weren't even given time to process what had actually happened to their family members. But they were given a camera and a microphone, and they were expected to automatically be forgiving of the heinousness that was done to their family member. All right? And it goes back to this psychological programming that happens when you begin to connect one group of people to the most powerful idea of salvation, of peace, of glory, of love, of transformation, of the saving of souls. When you do that over several centuries and you keep connecting only white European people to that image, all right, it does foster within some people that my image is not connected to that. All right. And for the other people, it fosters the mindset that my image is connected to that. All right. So we do need to understand that. We do need to understand how images play a role in maintaining power. They play a role in maintaining power. She says, I also believe some of the expressions they have over here is connected with black is evil. Yeah, I didn't even get to those images. Gosh. Let me see if I can find one real quick. There was one I saw where, maybe it's in this other book. Gosh. There was one I saw where the people, it was like showing levels, and it was supposed to be a depiction of the earthly life and then moving up levels to go to heaven. And there were no people of color in the entire piece. All right. In which we know that that was not true, because there were people of color during that time in those regions. There were no people of color in this painting. And all the devils were brown colored, and they had horns. They had hair on their bodies. They had tails and they had claws, and they were all holding hands outside of this little gate in a circle, waiting for those people who were involved in evil devices. They were waiting for them to die in the painting so that they could collect them for hell. All right. So the only people of color, or the only things of color in the paintings, were these evil creatures. All right. So that kind of stuff plays with people's psyche in a way that I don't think even they understand. All right. So this has been another Daring Dialogues. I hope that I have shown you something today. I hope that you have learned something today that you didn't know before. All right. And being aware of images, being aware of symbolism is a good thing. Understand that when you are watching television or you are being entertained, all right, you are being detained so something can enter you. That's what entertainment is. You're being detained so something can enter you. Either it's something good, or it's something evil, or it's something to make you think, something to make you question, etc., etc. Remember, artists create out of their spirit. Their spirit is pure. They're creating something. You may feel a measure of that. If something's perverted in their spirit and they're creating something, you may feel a measure of that, whatever you're partaking in. All right. And this is especially true about the mediums of art and music. All right. So I want to thank you again for your time and attention. And I hope that you have a great and wonderful day. Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness. So please go out today and be light. Again, thank you for your time and attention. I will try to find that image to put on my Daring Dialogues, the one that we discussed today that I was not able to show you. I'll try to take a picture of it so you can go and look on my Daring Dialogues page, and you'll be able to see that image. All right. Thank you again for your time and attention. Take care, and God bless. Thank you, Lady Judy, for hanging in there. Have a great and wonderful day. Take care, and God bless.